So welcome everyone to another episode of Virtual Quant Marketing Seminar. Today we're very happy to have Samsun Knight from the University of Toronto, who's going to talk about measuring the heterogeneity of TV advertising elasticities, evidence from 135 retail and restaurant brands. As usual, panelists, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions, and audience, please raise questions in the Q&A. I'll direct them to Samsun. So with that, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you guys so much for having me. I want to thank all the organizers of VQMS. This is a real honor to be here. And I'm really excited to present to you guys this joint work with Tsung-Yo Hsieh and Yakov Bart of measuring heterogeneity in TV advertising elasticities and evidence from 135 retail and restaurant brands. So for this study, kind of the broader context is that even though expenditures on linear TV advertising have been declining in recent years, it's still a massive advertising expenditure for many brands. There's around $50 to $60 billion annually in the US spent on linear TV advertising. But as I'm sure a lot of us are aware of, there's a recent major work showing that linear TV advertising for many brands is not estimated to achieve positive ROI. The profitability of TV advertising has come under sort of aggressive question for many brands. And so this paper, and here's the sort of like kind of canonical figures cribbed from this earlier paper showing that for a large majority of brands that are CPG brands in the Nielsen dataset, they're not estimated to actually get a positive return on their investment from their TV advertising expenditure. Obviously, this is sort of the incremental profitability from their TV ads. So this paper comes in the context of this kind of major work saying that TV advertising is not profitable and tries to put ourselves in the position of a brand responding to this finding, right? So if I'm a brand and I've just heard that, maybe I'm thinking of myself as the exceptional brand, as I'm sure a lot of brands do, where I'm the 20% making positive profitability. But say I'm a humble brand manager and I'm allowing that maybe TV advertising is not as profitable as I thought it was. How should I adjust my allocations of TV advertising? Obviously, when you have negative ROI, there's kind of the trivial response to unprofitability, which is to just shut it off. And apparently that would increase your net profits from this exercise. But I think a lot of brands are going to be approaching this presumably a little more conservatively. They're going to be thinking, okay, should I pull back just on all of my spending? Should I actually reallocate some of my spending across different areas? This is an example allocation on this screen of an actual observed allocation of advertising expenditure by a major brand in the US. And as we can see, they have a lot of sort of different areas targeted differentially, and beyond just sort of overall advertising levels, they may be considering, should I pull back on the places I'm spending the most? Should I concentrate on those markets where I think I'm getting the highest return? And if so, how much might that actually move the needle for my TV advertising profitability? And so that's where this paper really comes in. We're not going to, so for a marketing manager in this position, that answer is going to depend on the heterogeneity of advertising effects across areas and levels. And we're especially in this paper going to be talking about the heterogeneity across different areas. We aim for this to be a kind of two-sided contribution where we're going to try and really exhaustively measure the heterogeneity of effects across DMAs. And for managers, we hope this can be like a really practical, empirical exercise where we try and show how different allocation strategies might move the needle, both on just kind of their baseline elasticities and then further down on their projected profitability. And then for academics, we hope that this same exercise can kind of serve as a diagnostic, right? Where we can kind of try and understand a little bit more of, how much could this unprofitability be explained effectively by suboptimal allocations across different DMAs in the US, and what are the kind of behavioral, like observed patterns that seem to be associated with actual observed allocations versus sort of our estimated heterogeneity patterns. And so we're going to do this in 5 steps. In the first step, we're going to replicate Shapiro, Hitch, and Tuchman for storefront, restaurant, and retail brands. And this is probably the The first contribution of this paper is just to show that qualitatively we find a very similar story for a entirely new category of brands in the US, focusing on kind of storefront, restaurant, and retail. In the paper, we look a little bit at curvature over advertising levels, but we can only provide limited empirical guidance, so I'm not going to go into that today. And the meat of this paper is really about the distribution of heterogeneity kind of across areas. And here we're going to be looking at how much advertising effects seem to vary across different DMAs, maybe from targeting, maybe from like different responsiveness to TV ads. But how much does this actually present an opportunity for brands to improve their TV advertising profitability, and how much can this explain negative ROI? To really dig into it, obviously, once we've estimated heterogeneity, that doesn't necessarily mean that these brands aren't already aware of this and aren't already exploiting this heterogeneity fully and optimally. So we're going to try and characterize a little bit how much very constrained counterfactual reallocation exercise might move the needle on average elasticities and projected profitability, in order to characterize sort of how much this really represents sort of a margin for improvement, as well as sort of like a margin for understanding suboptimal allocations. And then finally, we're going to do some descriptive analysis to showing what are the areas that tend to get a lot of TV advertising expenditure, and how do those systematically differ from what we project would be kind of marginally improved allocations. And so these kind of like comprehensive five-step analysis, we hope to characterize how much of this TV advertising unprofitability might be explainable by suboptimal allocations across areas. And on the flip side of that same coin, how much could this represent an opportunity for managers to address some of their TV advertising underperformance by reallocating across DMAs? Do I see a...
Yeah, Samsun. Real quick here. So I appreciate, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at heterogeneity for a lot of reasons, right?
Yeah.
But thinking about the status quo, you mentioned multiple times that the status quo may not be profitable, right? I mean, for it to be not profitable, we would like to understand its comparison with a counterfactual where there is no advertising, right?
Right.
And my sense is that a lot of the estimates are done on the margin, right? So they estimate the ROI of the marginal dollar and not necessarily of the average dollar, right? So that's
Absolutely
a little bit of a difference in how, and the reason, there could be reasons why the marginal dollar is not profitable. One of the reasons could be that the targetability is not perfect. So the margin at which we are estimating things are, not the same as what is desirable by the advertiser, even if they know what they're doing. So just a few thoughts around that.
Absolutely. No, and I will get into that. You're anticipating a lot of my caveats of step 4, where we're really looking at sort of like marginal adjustments, kind of like in this equilibrium. And so when we talk about sort of like brands reallocating in our exercise, we're going to be thinking of this as like a single brand move. We're not going to be thinking of actually moving entirely to a new equilibrium, but imagining that a given brand sort of holding kind of the rest of the environment highly similar might be able to just and entirely by just reallocating across DMA level expenditures. But this is going to leave a lot of things potentially on the table. A lot of things that you mentioned about sort of like improved technologies that might improve targetability. We're really going to be looking at sort of like the imagining like the very first thing a single brand kind of deviating from what they're doing right now might achieve. But it's basically going to be like, and I'll reiterate this a lot when we get to step 4, we're going to be characterizing sort of like how many individual brands might be able to improve. And we're not going to be able to characterize if every brand reallocated. There's a lot that we wouldn't be able to characterize, right? There would be changes probably in costs across DMAs. You might get like we don't it's out of the scope of this paper to actually look at that full counterfactual.
Yeah, so just to close that point, it's I think there is value in exploring heterogeneity, as you're saying.
Yeah.
I was just commenting on the read of the status quo of
Yeah,
profitability.
absolutely. No, and that point is well taken. Great.
Samsung?
Can I ask a
Oh,
related question? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess what should we? I'm similar enough, Deep. I was struggling to think about what we should think of as the baseline, or sort of counterfactually, what I could do with my money. Is it that I don't spend anything, or is it that I reallocate across advertising channels? I was wondering if you've thought at all about like sort of uh, elasticities across channels as sort of a baseline for how much you could improve within versus across market.
That's a great question, and honestly, that's sort of like a dream follow-up that I've been talking to my co-authors about, something I'd love to explore. We basically try and capture the most limited version of like a reallocation within just the TV channel, and we're actually even more constrained than just keeping the same amount of spending in TV. We even don't even allow people to dynamically reallocate in our like very small or our sort of like a very constrained kind of reallocation exercise, but a something that I'm trying to get enough data to tackle is cross-channel reallocation, because I also think that's a lot of what when you talk about this type of thing with a lot of folks, folks are also mentioning that there can be a lot of cross-channel complementarities that can be really important for sustaining certain levels of TV advertising, and there's a lot that we won't be able to capture in this paper that I'm hoping to find an angle to in follow-up work. Because I absolutely agree with you that like if I'm really looking a marketing manager looking over my entire advertising budget, there's going to be many more degrees of adjustment that we're not going to capture here. First and foremost, cross channels. Yeah.
so a little bit related to the first two questions. So when I think about the reallocation in practice, I would imagine a lot of these decisions are made at the program level, especially, in the national upfront market, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a question of how granular can I actually target to different geographic areas and demographic groups, as opposed to just choosing which big program to invest in.
Yeah, I think so. We're reallocating like observed sort of DMA level, DMA specific budgets. So these are definitely parts of their ad budget that we know they have allocated for DMA specific targeting. But we're only going to be allowing brands to just on that like DMA level targeting. So program level targeting, I could imagine actually when I sort of talk to some folks about this because we do find some margin for improvement across DMAs, and my folk theorem, I guess, or my pet theory is that a lot of marketing targeting of sort of like TV advertising is thinking a lot about like we want to be targeting this TV program, and they're putting a lot of uh, uh, focus on targeting sort of like that right slot. But it seems that there's still margin for at least. I hope to convince you by the end of this talk for improvement in DMA specific targeting. But we're going to be essentially reallocating DMA specific ad expenditure. So we do, I think, feel that brands could plausibly allocate that differently across these DMAs.
Yeah, thanks. Just probably one more question. So Eric Brello is asking, so following on Olivia's comment, do you have interest in framing this as a multi-arm bandit or learn then earn problem, especially if you have to learn curvature and long run effect, as well as you have a lot of DMAs, channels, curvature, and heterogeneity, sort of building on the previous comment?
That's a really interesting question. I would say that like within sort of like we're only going to have sort of like a 3-year window for that we analyze. I would imagine that I would love to try and actually investigate brands learning over time, especially at the DMA level. We're mostly going to be talking about interpreting our results through sort of like a potentially sort of like targeting story or moderators of ad effectiveness. So we're not going to touch on that, but I love that idea. I feel like the learning, I think, will come into our story when we try to do a zoom out and we try to imagine sort of like why do we find this equilibrium with like these margins for improvement, and we can think about sort of like brands maybe being slow to learn about sort of changing ad effectiveness, especially we are going to find some heterogeneity over time that we don't investigate very deeply, but I personally find quite interesting. And so one of the sort of like high level motivations for why there might be room for improvement is sort of learning challenges. But yeah, it's not in the scope of this paper to characterize entirely as a multi-arm bandit problem, but again, I feel like that'd be an enticing follow-up. Yeah.
Probably one more question, sorry.
No
So
worries. Yeah.
Carl's asking brands, but audiences which vary by show and DMA. So when allocating, does it make more sense to do this across shows or DMAs? I guess that's kind of a bit related to what you've been talking about
Yeah,
before at the program level.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess right now I don't believe that we're observing um, I don't think we're accounting for like program specifics in our data, but that might be something that we should look into. Right now we're basically doing this kind of like high level DMA across DMA exercise. I will say that our estimates are going to be um, inferred from state-specific fixed effects. And so a lot of this heterogeneity is going to be comparing sort of like same state DMAs, in which I would hope that like a lot of the programming decisions are relatively comparable. But that's a great point, and I'll see if we observe that in our data and might be able to capture that, because that would be a fantastic sort of additional extension.
Thanks.
All right. Excellent. So just to give you guys the outline of this, I just sort of like went over the introduction. Next, I'm going to describe the related literature. I'm going to talk about the data and econometric specification, and then do this kind of like four-part exercise for today's talk of trying to characterize both heterogeneity across DMAs and advertising elasticities, and what brands might be able to achieve by reallocation. So this is a very redundant pause for questions, but I'll just move right past, assuming that we're good. So this study obviously relates to a really broad set of papers in marketing, and I would sort of like on a high level characterize this paper as analogous to how Shapiro, Hitch, and Tuchman were not the first to study advertising elasticity, but by doing so at a generalizable scale, they were able to get to infer sort of high-level insights that ended up of kind of average elasticity across a lot of brands, as well as Lodish et al. Our paper is basically trying to do something similar for heterogeneity, where we're going to try and estimate. We're not the first to estimate heterogeneity in advertising effectiveness by any means, or sort of like any of the other features we try to characterize. But our hopeful contribution is that by doing so at kind of like hundreds of brand scale, we can infer these larger insights, and also provide some insight into how it might relate to this kind of recently documented phenomenon of underperformance of TV advertising. And sort of in that vein, we're also going to look at sort of like papers that look at how like behavioral biases in advertising budgeting decisions and heuristic approaches for allocating ad budgets. So the data for this paper are going to come from mostly SafeGraph Spend and Nielsen Ad Intel. SafeGraph Spend is a store-level revenue and transactions data set for hundreds of thousands of retail and restaurant locations. It's based on kind of anonymized credit and debit card data that SafeGraph basically has partnered with a major financial intermediary that kind of processes a lot of transactions, and then they assign observed transactions and expenditures to their store panel for a week-by-store panel of revenue. The Ad Intel dataset, I imagine folks are fairly familiar with, so I won't describe in too much detail, but it's a comprehensive TV advertising dataset across a large number of media types, and that's going to give us week by DMA advertising gross rating points and expenditures. And then we're also going to bring in for our heterogeneity analyses census data. We're going to be looking at just sort of a high-level set of census covariates, including race, gender, age, education. And then we're going to merge this all together to a final panel of 135 brands that we can match across all of these data. One small subtlety here is we're going to be focusing on brands where you can think of like a chain restaurant where the brand has sort of like a single brand store. We're not going to be looking at brands like a shoe brand where they might have name brand stores, but also might have product carried at other stores, since we don't want to have, we want their advertising to just affect their stores, since we're going to be observing this kind of store level data set. For our econometric specification, we're going to be following very closely Shapiro, Hitch, and Tuchman. We're going to be implementing their same identification strategy, where we include kind of high dimensional fixed effects that control for the kind of exhaustive set of attributes that might be used to predict demand far in advance, and isolates plausibly quasi-random variation arising due to constrained slot availability and other factors. We're actually going to be a little bit more because we're thinking a lot about geographic heterogeneity and for some of the concerns that we've already briefly touched on, we're going to be using actually state by week fixed effects. And so you can think we have a store fixed effect and then a state by week fixed effect. And so you can think about our identification as essentially coming from comparing different DMAs in the same state that observe like net of these fixed effects, different residual levels of ad stock. So here we have the state of Missouri, and you can see sort of like these blue, green, and red dots would be essentially compared to one another to identify the effect of higher residual levels of advertising on store revenues. This still leaves us with a lot of variation to work with. This is fairly comparable to levels found in Shapiro, Hitch, and Tuchman. And what I'm graphing here, just to kind of fully lay it out, is essentially for each brand, a measure of the residual amount of advertising that's not explained by fixed effects or by competitor advertising. And so kind of like in our model, this would be the amount of variation that can be used to identify the effect or the elasticities of advertising. One more pause for questions.
I'll ask a question if that's okay, Samsun.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So thinking about both the set of things that we're studying, restaurants and retailers, and the time period, 2019 to 2021, how am I supposed to think about like the effect of COVID? That is, advertising effects may not be constant across this time period. And second, the way that you buy food for these two things, or I'm thinking mostly in terms of restaurants, the way you bought food during that time changed, where before you used to go directly to the restaurant, but now you may go through intermediaries like a DoorDash or a Grubhub. And does the SafeGraph data capture like that chain of intermediaries or whatever?
Yeah, so I would say multi-part response. So first of all, we're going to tackle that empirically in two ways. One is that during once we get to our heterogeneity specification, we're going to include kind of like year fixed effects to allow the effects of advertising to vary over time. And we're also going to provide robustness checks where we kind of leave COVID out, where we basically try and estimate our models without the COVID period included. Obviously, estimates are noisier when we're removing a fair amount of our the time periods we observe, but we do find that estimates are fairly stable and don't seem to be kind of qualitatively changed by the COVID period. That said, it's I honestly, when I was writing this, I felt that there could be an entire sub-analysis just devoted to looking at the changes during COVID, because we do find meaningful differences over time that we don't dig into in this paper, but that I think is one of the kind of neat little sub-findings that I feel could be much more deeply explored than we do here, where we find that particularly for restaurant brands, I believe, the advertising becomes much less effective in 2021. We find that sort of like the elasticities, I think for all brands kind of goes through like a little bit of a downturn and then comes back up in 2022. But that's especially sharp for restaurants. And we're not like, it's not the focus of this paper to kind of like dig into that. So we do kind of these sort of these exercises to try and account for this without while acknowledging it's kind of out of the scope of our current focus. But I absolutely think that like something else I would love to do with these data is to really dig into that. And to your point about whether it's observed in the SafeGraph data, they do have, I believe they have some statistics about whether it's a delivery. They will capture delivery orders. They'll capture orders that like are sort of like come from that store, but then are delivered by like DoorDash. Um, and then I believe they also observe uh, yeah, we haven't dug into that part of the data. We're kind of using their just like headline raw statistics for this exercise. But yeah, I would we it would be something that I'd love to sort of like dig deeper on, but we mostly kind of gesture at, and I was going to highlight once we get to that slide that here's like an interesting thing we don't do much with. But it's something that I would it's very suggestive what we see, and so it would be interesting. Yeah.
Samson, really quick question on the previous slide. I was trying to get a sense of the amount of residual variation relative to the average advertising stock, like how much is
That's
it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have that off the top of my head. There's some summary statistics in the paper I'd love to compare that to. I would mostly we benchmark this against the this is like slightly more residual variation than is documented in the Shapiro Hitch and Tuchman example. But I should have that comparison. So I mean, I will say that this is like a this statistic is the ratio of standard deviation of the residual to the mean in that like store DMA week. So this is the ratio to the average level. But I should have a sense of what the average ad stock is, and I'm blanking on it now.
So if this is the ratio to the average level, this is saying that you observe a very wide range. I mean, this is like 500%. I mean,
for a small number of brands, there's pretty wide range. Yeah. For most brands, it's in more modest levels. And this is sort of like but there are a few that have appear to have high residuals. Yeah.
Got it.
Great. Okay. So without further ado, now I'm going to present to you our first step result, which is the baseline elasticity distribution. We won't spend as much time on this here because this is sort of essentially we're replicating Shapiro, Hitch, and Tuchman for this new context. And we are finding qualitatively pretty similar distribution. We find a median level of advertising of 0.016. We do find a slightly higher mean level of advertising, but I would say that kind of the qualitative takeaways from this distribution are quite similar to that earlier work. And I would also say, kind of as a preview of much later results, is that this does carry through when we project to ROI levels using a lot of kind of, highly caveated back of the envelope projection. We also find that there's high ratios of observed unprofitable advertising in this sort of storefront retail and storefront restaurant setting, at least when measured in this sort of in this incrementality sense. We also include here, kind of like in these lower lines, a handful of robustness checks. So to the point about COVID, when we exclude COVID from our specification, we find a highly similar distribution. Obviously, it's a little noisier because we have a smaller sample. We also do a border specification following Shapiro 2018, where we're only comparing DMAs or stores on the border of DMAs, and we find slightly attenuated distribution. But that's actually, in some ways, it's motivated, or it's enclosed in the paper that border areas would be different than kind of like a more central areas, since we account for a lot of heterogeneity across areas. So this is actually fairly in line with the paper's broad thrust. And then finally, we also use a log specification and find qualitatively similar results. I will say that for most of the paper, we use a kind of linear baseline rather than a log baseline. We find that this has a better fit for sort of like small or a slightly higher proportion of brands, but it doesn't drive our results either one we use. Did I see a question in the chat?
Carmela has a clarifying question. Is the
Yeah.
added elasticity coming from just contemporaneous impression shocks or infinite horizon as a ad stock construction?
Yeah, so these are based on ad stock. This is, I will say, I think it's sort of like probably a best characterized as like a year horizon based on the delta of kind of exponential decay that we use. So I wouldn't say that like one note for interpretation here is that there could be sort of like very, very long run effects that we're not capturing here. But yeah, this is based on a ad stock specification. Something I mentioned briefly was we do see a little bit of differences across the two industries we examine. So this is separating storefront retail from storefront restaurants. And we find, obviously, the distributions have a high degree of overlap, but we do find that restaurants appear to have a lower median elasticity than retail brands. We're not able to make many like very strong claims about why this might be. We don't see that it's sort of like necessarily explained by the kind of allocation across DMAs, because when we do this kind of constrained reallocation exercise, the gap broadly remains. But it's an interesting feature of the data that we're able to see that like the retail equilibrium appears to have slightly higher average levels of profitability. When we carry this all the way through to ROI, that also extends, where we found around half of retail brands achieve positive ROI versus around a quarter of restaurant brands. Obviously, again, based on back of the envelope projections to ROI. Great. And now we're going to look at kind of the next step of our multi-step exercise of estimating heterogeneity across areas. And we're really thinking across DMAs, right? And so we're going to, for each DMA, compute a set of sort of both store and area characteristics. And this is kind of high-level demographic characteristics, including population density and median income, as well as some kind of rudimentary market structure characteristics of how many of your own stores do you have in this DMA, how many competitor stores do we observe in this DMA, as well as temporal variation. Again, we're just trying to characterize how much advertising, these sort of like advertising residuals may go farther or less far in areas for each brand with different characteristics. And you could think of this as coming from, maybe more of my target market is in this area. It could be that there are certain demographics that are just more responsive to linear TV advertising. We try to be very cautious in interpreting these results, and we mostly try and claim that it represents that they're likely to be stable under marginal reallocation. So here's an example of what we're going to do for every single brand, right? This sort of first column here is the baseline ad elasticity computation that I just showed you, right? So this is kind of the estimator that underlies those distributions of elasticities in the last few slides. And then the second column is the exercise that we're next going to carry out. And so for every single brand in our sample, we estimate the heterogeneity of ad effects across this kind of constrained set of characteristics. And something here that I'll highlight is not uncommon, that I already mentioned around the heterogeneity over COVID, is that for this brand and for a number of brands, we do see a dip in 2021 in observed and measured estimated ad effectiveness. When we look across the wide set of brands, that tends to be slightly more common. And so here is sort of like what we do here is we compute how many brands have significantly positive or significantly negative interaction terms across this wide set of area and store characteristics. And again, as I mentioned on the last slide, I want to we try to be very careful about not overinterpreting this. We're not making a claim that for 10% of brands, just moving a bunch of men into a DMA will causally make their advertising more effective. But we are saying that DMAs with some of these characteristics will be do seem to be more effective for their advertising, and under marginal reallocation will be a place where they'll achieve higher ad effects. Some of these characteristics, especially the ones that are more balanced, I broadly interpret as representing, different target markets. Some of them that are more imbalanced conjecturally may sort of be associated with, as I was saying, sort of different moderators of ad effectiveness, where different demographic groups may tune in more to linear advertising or be more responsive for reasons that are kind of outside the scope of this study to address. It could also be, though, that this is entirely driven by target markets, and that for the brands we have in our study, they just happen to have, for example, more like urban professionals as their target markets. And that's why we see kind of like more dense, more educated areas tend to see positive interaction terms. I'll also say that the amount of heterogeneity that we measure is pretty considerable relative to the baseline elasticities. So this is sort of for each brand in our sample, we estimate how much the projected variation varies over DMAs. And so we try and measure sort of like what is the standard deviation of projected ad elasticity across DMAs based on our estimated interaction terms. And we recover a median standard deviation of 0.05, not like ludicrously large, but plausibly representing a kind of a pretty material difference in profitability levels from advertising in an area maybe with more of your target market versus an area with less of your target market. Great. So that was a lot. So I want to pause here for questions in case anyone
Maybe I'm over-indexing on the one brand example you showed, but
yeah.
It seemed like adding all these demographics didn't improve the amount, like your R squared was flat. How should we think about this, the relative importance of this heterogeneity as opposed to sort of the other fixed effects in the model?
That is a great point. Yeah, I would say that most of the variation is definitely being captured by fixed effects. And this kind of relates, I think, more broadly to kind of earlier discussion we were having about whether this was really sort of going to be the most material angle of reallocation, right? Like where like is reallocating across DMAs going to be the most important versus other dimensions where there actually might be kind of shorter distance to making headway on advertising elasticities. We're not necessarily, you're absolutely right that it's not like adding an enormous amount of explanatory power here. And it may not be sort of like the kind of most important explainers for kind of advertising heterogeneity. This paper's focus is just going to be on sort of like how, like if we just carve out this, how much can we quantify? And when I get to the end, we're going to basically say a portion, and we're not going to be able to sort of like account for like we're going to make a claim that this can account for a meaningful minority of unprofitability, but it's not going to be sort of like by any means a cure-all or sort of like a major kind of qualitative overhaul. But that is still a great point. Yeah, most of this R squared is coming from fixed effects. And it's not coming from the kind of marginal effects model.
There's a
Can
question.
I ask?
Sorry, Jenny, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was curious if, so is it the reason you are casting these based on these covariates, is it because we don't have enough precision to estimate things per DMA? So we have to, in a way, to try to look for these heterogeneities across DMAs by relating to these variables that we're able to collect.
That's a great question. Yeah, the in principle, we could estimate essentially a DMA specific interaction term for all 200 DMAs in the US, and then actually sort of I would say that like we're largely doing this out of power concerns. Already we have sort of like a you know, I mean, we find significant effects, but we're not finding sort of like a high degree of significance across all of these covariates. So this is sort of like a one could imagine though, like for a sort of like first best implementation by a brand trying to take this and run with it would be to estimate DMA specific heterogeneity. I think that ours is sort of like the goal of this paper is really to show a kind of proof of concept that there is heterogeneity that is meaningful, that's not being fully accounted for by brands. And we're not making a claim that this is like the best possible way to measure that heterogeneity. And if I were a brand, I might want to like apply something much more sophisticated to actually measure what would be my best target areas, including a DMA specific kind of a heterogeneity measure. And that would be, yeah, I think out of, especially for, yeah, I think out of power concerns, we start with just kind of like this simple like way to characterize DMA and store characteristics. But in principle, that would absolutely be a great follow-up. Yeah, I think if I were a brand, that might be like, you know, not my first step, but maybe my second step to see if I could actually get DMA specific measures of this heterogeneity.
Shindo Kobayashi has a question. Have you thought about using a Bayesian model or empirical base to reduce the noise we see in the heterogeneous effect? One can imagine noise would impact the reallocation exercise.
Interesting. So like performing like empirical based shrinkage across the distribution of estimated effects. Yeah, that had not occurred to me, but that would be probably well considered. Yeah, I think right now our online appendix is already like approaching 100 pages, so we've been like shy about. But that would be that's a great point. Yeah, I think that would be very doable and would probably be helpful for the kind of second step analyses we perform. Yeah, that's a great note. We'll take that down. Great. Excellent. So so kind of with that in mind, that leads us kind of quite naturally into this counterfactual exercise. And I'm using counterfactual, I think as we already discussed, you might consider this sort of like more of like a single mover counterfactual, almost like a back of the envelope exercise to try and characterize, you know, how much is this actually a margin for improvement, or is this just something that brands are already aware of? And also to help characterize the fact that you know we're measuring different store level ad effectiveness, but some DMAs may have more effectiveness, may get more bang for your buck simply because they have more of your stores. And so we don't want to sort of like characterize that like these DMAs may seem to be less effective when in fact that'll actually give you more bang for your buck. So in order to kind of very thoroughly characterize the potential for gains here, we're going to do a highly constrained reallocation exercise with what we hope are very, very conservative constraints. We're going to fix every single period's budget for each brand, the total budget. We are not going to allow any brand to have projected impressions that exceed the maximum for a given brand DMA. We don't want to go outside the support of our data. And similarly for ad expenditure, we don't want to, we're basically going to say like within the amount of impressions and ad spend that we know are possible for this brand DMA pair, what would be sort of the optimal allocation, holding every single dynamic budget fixed. We're going to measure differential returns based on the kind of model estimates from this earlier step. And then to complete this exercise, we do need a sense of cost trade-offs. And so we're going to measure DMA-specific cost curvature using the Nielsen Ad Intel expenditure data. Here we're going to use DMA by brand and DMA by week scaling factors to kind of give a DMA-specific cost curvature, allowing for the fact that some brands are known to have like relationships with ad providers in certain regions, and also allowing this to vary systematically over time. And then we're going to use a simple kind of square root functional form to enforce increasing costs per impression. So once we sort of carry out that exercise for each brand, and again, this is sort of imagining a single brand deviating from this equilibrium, but and then characterizing for all brands what the average level of kind of re-optimized lift is. First of all, we find that the baseline ad lift, kind of in line with the fact that we find close to zero ad elasticities, is quite small at median. We find around sort of like a 0.3% lift. But brands can improve, are estimated to be able to improve their ad lift by around 2 percentage points at median. So not, again, sort of like to everyone's point, sort of it's not a sea change, but it's a meaningful improvement. We're not saying, our estimates do not suggest that this will completely qualitatively change their return from advertising, but it can move the needle. And we do find that for a number of brands, it can move it by a fair proportion. Do I see? Oh, I'll stop there
Two
before, while we're getting
questions,
questions on
yes.
this. Yeah.
So Brian Bollinger is asking, is a cost curvature depending on that focal brand's advertising level, or is it a function of all brands advertising?
The cost curvature, we actually impose we're imposing a square root cost curvature. It's just as like a simple approximation of kind of increasing cost per impression. We provide robustness to other cost curvatures, and we don't find that it's like qualitatively dissimilar, but this is sort of we allow this to scale by the DMA by brand, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I'm answering the question very well.
Maybe Brian can follow up on.
Yeah, maybe let's
what you're addressing the
let me
question
touch base after the talk about that.
Yeah,
I
or
think
we can,
maybe
push it
I think
to
that
the end of the discussion. And then Carl has a clarifying question. So the ad costs are GRPs per impression, and the response function, as you showed earlier, is in a unit of ad stock. That's correct, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and so yeah, so that's actually a great subtlety. So essentially, what we do is for every brand, we're kind of constructing ad stock as we go. So we start in the first period, and we do a counterfactual reallocation for that first period. Then the next period, that becomes part of that brand's counterfactual ad stock. And so we counterfactually we counterfactually build the ad stock period by period. First, we take essentially the ad stock in 2018 as fixed. That's kind of like the 52-week ad stock that we do not reallocate. And then 2019 is when our revenue panel begins, and we reallocate that first week. Then we treat that first week as fixed, reallocate the second week, treat that second week and first week as fixed, and iteratively go all the way through every week in our sample, kind of continuing with the ad stock framework. But you're absolutely, that's a great point, and thank you for asking me to clarify that. I will make a note on this slide to make that clearer. That should have been clarified.
Yeah, thanks. And Matt Gershoff has a question I'll just read. So with respect to costs, which vary over DMA within the ad buy, I believe there can also be the option to buy remnant time slots. Is that something meaningful and can be considered?
We're not going to capture it. I guess to the extent that like the proportion of remnant ad stock sort of like varies by DMA and week systematically, and that might affect sort of like cost levels that'll be captured in this cost model. But I don't think I believe that would be in the residual otherwise, that we're not going to be capturing sort of like a sort of unexpected variation in that regard. But yeah, that's a great point. Is that the last question, or is there any?
So Brian has a follow-up. So you can decide whether you want to address it now or later. So his comment is, he was surprised that costs increase versus being just some set cost per GRP. And wouldn't the market price so the ad cost depend on total demand for ads, not the focal firm's demand.
I see. Yeah, yeah. So I would say that like uh I may want to circle back on this once I've had a chance to think on this a little bit more. I'm not coming up with I would say that right now, again, sort of like in the context of this being a very partial exercise, that we're thinking of this as capturing sort of uh, like cost curvature for this individual brand's deviation, sort of leaving most of the market fixed. We're not going to be capturing sort of how, like if average advertising levels in this market changed, costs probably would systematically also shift. And if everybody reallocated in this manner, that's going to be outside of the scope of this sort of very simple counterfactual exercise. And I believe right now our goal in this estimation is to capture sort of like a curvature that would represent sort of like the cost curvature from deviating for a single brand taking this equilibrium as effectively stable, and that they're not essentially changing that equilibrium. But there may be a deeper point here that I'm overlooking that I'd love to follow up on and make sure that we're accounting for that appropriately. Thanks for the yeah. Let me circle back on that later. Great. Excellent. All right, so here, as we were before, we find sort of like it moves the needle. It's not sort of like a sea change. And similarly, when we project the ROI from advertising for kind of like the current levels of observed elasticities, and then this kind of counterfactual marginally reallocated, which we call sort of like relatively optimal, we find that it can bring around 15% of brands from negative profitability to positive profitability. And so again, it's like there's still a large proportion of brands who their negative profitability can't be explained by suboptimal reallocation across DMAs, and is likely from other features of the kind of advertising landscape. But there is still a proportion here where it does seem like this is making the difference. And as noted before, there's a gap here in profitability that we measure between retailers and restaurants. And that gap stays actually pretty similar even when we do this reallocation exercise, suggesting that it's not that one of these store types is targeting DMAs more effectively than the other, and that the differences in measured profitability appear to be coming from something outside of the scope of this paper to capture. And again, this is just to make sure I'm crystal clear that we're measuring ROI following the similar approach to Shapiro, Hitch, and Tuchman. We find that the gross margin based on both reported industry for reports for a subsample of brands, as well as a cited source, are around 30% for each of these industries, but we provide a range of margins just to show that qualitatively it's a similar increase. And again, there's a lot of caveats that come with this ROI. It may be best characterized as conservative, but our main focus for this paper is the change. And so we don't think that biases in these ROI would bias the fact that it's moved for a meaningful minority of brands from negative to positive profitability. All right. And so I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but feel free to rush me if I'm running up against it.
You have about 7 minutes or so. So
great. All right, that should be great. So now, as our kind of final exercise, we perform kind of descriptive analysis where we say, okay, like we appear to have a meaningful amount of heterogeneity that we've estimated across DMAs for a lot of these brands. It doesn't appear to be fully exploited by the observed allocations we see in our data. So what are brands targeting? What do we actually see is associated with observed allocations that doesn't seem to be this kind of estimated heterogeneity across different regions? And so we're going to do something very just simple and descriptive here, where we're just going to look at what types of characteristics are associated with actual allocations. And then we're going to compare those to the observed counterfactual improved allocations and see what systematically correlates with the gap. So for this first exercise, we're just going to we're going to regress the observed allocation percentage against these kind of this set of characteristics. We don't find that very much variation at all is explained by the characteristics that we estimate heterogeneity over, but a lot of variation. We had like an R squared of 0.03, but very simple heuristics, especially kind of inertia in ad spend and existing revenue share, achieve an R squared of 0.46. And then when we add these other characteristics in, we don't actually see very much more variation explained once we've included this set of heuristics, as well as whether the DMA is close to the brand headquarters. So sort of visibility to executives is another important one. And this one I like to link to a great finding, I think, in the consumer churn literature, where brands tend to target their most tended to target their most disloyal customers rather than the customers with the highest return to kind of loyalty interventions. And similarly here, we see that brands really seem to be targeting DMAs where they just have a lot of revenue already, rather than DMAs where you might get the highest marginal revenue increment from additional advertising. And then once we can also difference the observed allocations to the counterfactual allocations, and we find that they tend to be appear to be over targeting, especially kind of higher income, denser areas. And so just to kind of wrap the talk all the way back around, this is the figure that I showed you guys at the very top of the talk of the observed allocation for this major brand. When we do our kind of counterfactual reallocation, we find that they're moving a lot of spending away from what I would broadly call kind of like legacy cities. So you have sort of like Seattle and San Francisco towards more kind of like mid-sized cities in the Midwest and the South, and in particular in Miami. It seems like a lot of cities that like experienced maybe recent growth, according to our estimates, would be a opportunity for brands to advertise more heavily in that they're not currently exploiting. And especially it feels like areas where like sort of the top tier cities appear to get an outsized share compared to the second tier cities. And so here's sort of like the visual of the difference when we sort of like subtract this observed allocation from this optimized allocation. We call this kind of suboptimal spending. It's a directional variable. So the blue here would be sort of like projected, let me make sure I get this right, projected overspending, and the red here would be projected underspending effectively. And so we see that sort of like New York, LA, Seattle, Boston seem to be getting a large amount of ad expenditures that does not appear to be justified by the heterogeneity of effectiveness, the comparative heterogeneity of effects of ads in these regions. We then do the same exercise for every single brand in our sample, looking for kind of systematic patterns. And again, just to highlight, Miami seems to be very overlooked. It seems like it's a city that's recently grown very rapidly and maybe has become a higher return region than brands are currently aware of to target. And a lot of cities that sort of like have historically, maybe again, like through inertia, have always gotten a lot of ad expenditure, appear to be getting an outsized share of ad expenditures. Great, and that's the that's our talk. And so we find basically that TV advertising has been estimated to be unprofitable for a lot of brands. We replicate that finding. We don't find that it's as simple in every respect as just sort of overspending everywhere. We find that it appears that there's some underspending in certain regions, some overspending in other regions. And sort of on a higher level, just to like kind of take a step back, I like to link this to, if you'll permit me a maybe wide digression, there was a big puzzle in the 2010s in health economics, where people thought there was an epidemic of over-testing in the US. And this came from a lot of empirical work showing that the marginal test that was administered didn't justify itself in a cost-benefit analysis. But then there was a seminal paper by Sendel Mullnathan and Ziad Obermeyer that showed that it wasn't just as simple as over-testing. It was actually that determining the allocation of testing was just really hard. And certain types of people were getting too many kind of heart disease tests, and other types of people were getting under-tested. And I would say that sort of by analogy, what our paper is trying to do is something similar in advertising effects, where I think there's been a kind of headline finding, which I think is definitely like broadly the case of sort of we found that advertising is ineffective for a lot of brands. But I would say that it's not in every respect potentially as simple as just over allocation everywhere. It may be that there's misallocation, but it might not be that we're so clear that it's just a single overspending story. And that's my talk, and I'll stick around for more questions and discussion. And thank you so much to everyone for coming.